my name is Caleb, and today I am continuing my series where I just address various Catholic and Orthodox arguments against Protestantism that I encounter online. This should be part 3. And today I am going to be addressing something that I heard initially from Tremaine Collins on Instagram. And his reel will just be screenshotted right here. Now, he's not the originator of this specific argument. I think Joe Heschmeyer is. His book, The Early Church Was Catholic. And the main argument is just that early Protestants consciously rejected tradition for 1,500 years, that had been in place for 1,500 years. And the specific tradition he's speaking about is the sacrifice of Mass. And he quotes Luther a number of times, and well, just he doesn't do a very good job of quoting Luther. But before I get into that, I just want to briefly explain a Lutheran view of tradition in a general sense. Because we do not wholesale reject tradition, but we have this distinction where Scripture is the norma normans and tradition is the norma normata. And what that means is that Scripture is the norming norm, a norm that norms other norms, and tradition, creeds, confessions, councils, are norms, but they are normed by Scripture. That if they contradict it, then, well, they can't. They should be rejected. Now, understanding that, one specific norm that we have is the Book of Concord. This is the main norm. Now, this document does not reject tradition, far from it. As far as Protestant confessions of faith are concerned, this is very patristic. I believe it cites fathers and councils at least 200 times, definitely more. But it cites Augustine, Jerome, Cyprian, Cyril, Ambrose, Chrysostom, I think, did I mention him? I think Irenaeus a couple times as well, and several more. That's not exhaustive. This is probably the Protestant confession that engages most deeply with exegesis of patristic testimony. It does not reject tradition. Not at all. Also, I'm just also going to explain briefly Chemnitz's understanding of tradition. He explains in his examination of the Council of Trent, there are approximately, you can divide traditions into about 8 different types, or at least he does. And the first tradition is that which was preached orally, then committed to writing in Scripture. So basically just the Scriptures and the plain teachings of the Scriptures, originally taught orally by the apostles, then committed to writings. That can be rightly called a tradition, and we accept that, obviously. And the second tradition, concerning the reception and preservation of Scripture, that would just be, like the preservation of texts, the passing down of that, and information about the Scriptures, like who wrote what. That's totally fine. We don't have an issue with that. 3, creeds and confessions, like the Apostles' Creed, the Nicene Creed, the Athanasian Creed, Concord. These are just basic summaries of the faith, and we don't have an issue accepting them. various rules of interpretation. That would be the fourth tradition. And these, he cites Irenaeus, Tertullian, and Augustine on this point, and he explains the various rules, like that the plain sense should be the primary sense, where unless Scripture demands another sense, like an allegorical or a metaphorical or anything like that, but that should be the first understanding. And then like, say, interpreting things according to the rule of faith, which would be, the Apostles' Creed historically, and that the Apostles' Creed can be a good rule for interpreting Scripture, but it's also just the plainest teachings of Scripture. There's nothing in the Apostles' Creed that can't, I think, very easily be discerned from reading the Scriptures, but it's a good, concise summary that can help be a little rule when interpreting certain obscure passages of Scripture. And that's where we go into, like, the rule of faith as well. He cites Augustine for this, where Scripture must be interpreted in accordance with Scripture. And then finally, if something is mysterious and beyond human creaturely understanding, we don't try to speculate, we just accept the mystery. Those are some basic rules that we have no issue with, and they're traditional rules. Doctrines is the fifth tradition. Doctrines not explicit yet inferred as a necessary consequence of what is. Things like infant baptism would be one thing that I think is cited. And I mean, it's not necessarily explicit yet. You have the household baptisms. You also have Colossians, I think, describing baptism as the new circumcision, or circumcision made without hands. And then you have in Acts, when Peter's talking about baptism, he says, "This promise is for you and your children." You can definitely infer some stuff from that. Also the fact that, baptism saves, everyone is born in sin, etc., etc. It's not that difficult to infer this from the text itself. And we can rightly consider that to be a tradition, but it's also a tradition within Scripture. And then 6, the consensus of the Fathers. We do not reject that. Lots of Catholics and Orthodox will try to say certain things are the consensus, which can't really be established, and there's certain Church Fathers that will contradict certain things that they'll say. Beyond, like, historically speaking, beyond, say, the ecumenical creeds and the first several ecumenical councils, it'd be very difficult to establish a consensus on the first 7 or 100 years or something like that. So, do not reject that. Rites observed, this would be 7, rites observed by the Church that are not dogma. So that would just be things like feast days, fasting rules, various different liturgical prayers. None of that we reject. That's totally fine. The only tradition that we reject is this last tradition, Tradition 8, which is unwritten tradition claimed to be apostolic dogma that is binding on all the faithful. That's it. The only tradition we reject. So, far be it from, rejecting tradition wholesale. We only reject one very specific type of tradition. Now, I'm going to get into the video now, and, Joe's argument, which is just quoting Luther and quoting him fairly badly. And I'll just show a couple screenshots here at points of both Joe and the work of Luther he is quoting, which is the Babylonian captivity of the church. And I will just get into the first quote, which is, Joe quotes Luther. Well, he says, this is Joe speaking here, so this position, that is, according to him, a rejection of the sacrifice of the Mass, puts Protestants at odds with the whole pre-Reformation Christianity. A fact the Reformers readily admitted. Martin Luther laments, there is no belief in the Church more generally received or more firmly held than that the Mass is a good work and a sacrifice. So, yes, he is quoting Luther there, Babylonian captivity. However, he omits something that is very important to contextualize the quote. Joe would have you believe that Luther is talking about the whole pre-Reformation church, and he is consciously rejecting that. He says, a fact the Reformers readily admitted. But Luther states, this is the actual quote, should be here, there is no belief in the church today more generally received or more firmly held than that the Mass is a good work and a sacrifice. Why did you take today out? That seems kind of strange. Kind of contextualizes the whole thing, doesn't it? Anyways, he also quotes him again. Luther explains that the Church universally believed this for good reasons, since it agrees with the witness of the early Christians and the liturgical text itself. Now, he quotes Luther again. I don't have that quote fully here, but I believe in the quote he specifically says that they appear to have a good argument or something along those lines based upon the patristic texts and the liturgical texts. Now, he says they appear to have a good argument. I can say legitimately that, say like a Muslim appears to have a good argument when they, talk about Jesus not knowing the hour or something like that. But then, if you know, say the Greek oiden can mean to declare rather than only referring to cognitive knowledge, and also elsewhere in Scripture, the apostles describe Jesus as knowing all things. So the Muslims can appear to have a good argument when you take one verse in isolation, devoid of context or a knowledge of the Greek. But when you actually know those things, they don't have a good argument. So the only thing Martin's conceding here is that there is an appearance of a good argument. He is not conceding that there is a good argument. Now, he quotes Luther again to say, that he would basically, reject the canon and the fathers. Luther says, it would be safer to deny their authority altogether than to grant the Mass is a work and a sacrifice, and thus to deny the word of Christ and to overthrow faith and the Mass together. So again, he is quoting the Babylonian captivity. But I'll just share the whole thing. What shall we say, then, of the canon of the Mass and the patristic authorities? First of all, I would answer, if there were nothing at all to be said against them, this is a qualified statement, if there were nothing to be said against them, I believe he's referring to the Papalists and their interpretation of the Fathers. I would answer, if there is nothing to be said against them, it would be safer to deny their authority altogether than to grant the Mass is a work and a sacrifice, and thus to deny the word of Christ and to overthrow faith and the Mass together. The very next sentence, nevertheless, in order to retain them, we shall say that we are instructed by the apostle in 1 Corinthians 11 that it was customary for Christ's believers, when they came together for Mass, to bring with them food and drink. These they called collections, and they distributed them among all those that were in want after their example. of the example of the apostles in Acts 4. From this store was taken a portion of the bread and wine, and that was consecrated in the sacrament. And since all this store was consecrated by the word and prayer, by being lifted up according to the Hebrew rite, of which we read about in Moses, the words and rite of this lifting up offering have come down to us, although the custom of bringing along and collecting that which was offered or lifted up has long since fallen into disuse. And he just continues to explain the tradition. But moving on, he says, for this reason the words sacrifice and offering must be taken to refer not to the sacrament and the testament, but to the collections themselves. So the very next sentence, he then goes on a whole paragraph to explain how the writings of the fathers and the canon can be understood contrary to the papalists' claim, and he makes an argument for that. That is not a conscious rejection of the Church Fathers. That's explicitly trying to reconcile them with his doctrines. Now, you can disagree with his interpretation, but your argument is that he is consciously rejecting the Church Fathers. That is blatantly false. Thank you for listening.